Hi, I'm Rick Steves. In this Travel as a Political Act special, I'll share experiences and lessons gleaned from a lifetime of traveling, adventuring from Iran to Denmark and Morocco to El Salvador. And I'll explain how travel can humanize our world and give us a better understanding of the challenges that come with globalization. My goal? To inspire you to travel out of your comfort zone, gain an empathy with the other 96% of humanity, and bring home what I consider the greatest of all souvenirs, a broader perspective. Thanks for joining us.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rick Steves!
Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, I've been fortunate to spend a good part of my adult life traveling out of my comfort zone, hanging out with people who find different truths to be self-evident and God-given. And it really challenges my cultural self-assuredness. It wallops my ethnocentrism. And these experiences I consider the most valuable travel experiences that I've ever had. And I'd like today to share them with you in a talk. It'll be about an hour of how travel can be transformational. It's a talk I call Travel as a Political Act. Now, I've traveled a lot. I've spent a third of my adult life living out of a 9x22 carry-on-the-airplane-sized suitcase, hanging out overseas. And, you know, I've just had this passion for teaching. I love to make mistakes, take careful notes, and bring home the lessons from that experience. I've been teaching now ever since I was a college kid, and I didn't have a grand plan, but if I look back on it over the decades, there's been a logical evolution in my teaching. At first, back in the 1980s, I wrote a book called Europe Through the Back Door, and it was all about the basic skills of independent budget travel. How to catch the train, how to pack light, how to get a good hotel, and so on. I would go to Europe and I would take notes, somebody would rip me off and I'd get all excited. Thank you, now I know that scam, and I'd bring it home and teach people that. In the 90s, I thought, you know, we know how to catch the train. Let's enjoy and appreciate the history and the art. So I was all about teaching history and art for travelers. I wrote a book called Europe 101, and that was, to me, the big challenge. You know, I wanted to help people who were smart people, who were sleeping in their history and art classes before they knew they were going to Europe, remember who the Etruscans were and what's the difference between Romanesque and Gothic, and that would help their sightseeing be more meaningful. So I'm kind of sliding up that Maslow's hierarchy of travel needs, if you know what I mean. Since 9/11, it occurs to me that the pinnacle of that hierarchy of travel needs is traveling in a way that gets us out of our comfort zone, traveling in a way that gives us an empathy for the other 96% of humanity, and lets us come home with sort of an inclination to build bridges rather than building walls. And I think that's what's called Travel as a Political Act, and we're going to talk about that now. Have you noticed how riddled with fear our country is lately? We've never been more afraid. I'm concerned about that because when a society is afraid, people with a wrong kind of motive can take advantage of that society and make them become something that they're not. There's a lot of fear right now in the United States of America, and the most fearful Americans are the Americans that are buried deep in the middle of this country with no passports. This is a concern. Fear is for people who don't get out much. The flip side of fear is understanding, and we gain understanding when we travel. I think it's important for our very democracy. It's important for our stability that we get out there, we travel, and we gain an empathy for the other 96% of humanity. Now, did you remember in the old days, people used to say, bon voyage? When was the last time you heard somebody say bon voyage? We don't say that anymore. What do we say? Have a safe trip. We'll pray for you. Do you think it's a good idea to be going over there considering all that's happening? Have a safe trip. When somebody tells me have a safe trip, I'm inclined to say, well, you have a safe stay at home. Because where I'm going, if you understand the statistics, and I know statistics are optional these days, but if you understand the statistics, where I'm going is safer than where you're staying. This is critical that we get out there, we get a grip, we don't confuse fear and risk, and we learn how to play ball with the rest of the world. Now, my job as a travel writer is to inspire and equip Americans to get out there and celebrate the diversity on this planet. My beat is Europe. My favorite country is India. But my mission really is to get Americans just to go beyond Orlando. I got no problem with Orlando, but if you've gone to Disney World 4 or 5 times, consider Portugal. Now, this is a tough sell for a lot of Americans. There's only one guidebook in this country that outsells the Rick Steves Italy guidebook, and that's the guidebook to Disney World. All right? That's a huge market, because for a lot of Americans, travel is La La Land, and that's exactly what Disneyland's all about, you know? It's fun, it's cool, it's La La Land. There is a reality. Considering the complexity and the importance of the challenges facing our nation today, I think it's constructive that we get beyond La La Land and we connect with the world. That's what we're talking about now in Travel as a Political Act. As I mentioned, my beat is Europe because to me, Europe is the wading pool for world exploration. Go there first, have a good time, then you can go further afield. Most of my anecdotes and experiences are in Europe, and we'll talk about a lot of those today. For instance, my job as a travel writer is to bring home the magic. And boy, there's a lot of magic to enjoy. There's natural wonders. We have great wonders here in the United States. The great thing about Europe's natural wonders is they're so accessible. They're so accessible. And you gain an appreciation for nature. I mean, here we are, high in the Alps. Can you imagine tight roping on a ridge, high in the Alps? On one side, you got lakes stretching all the way to Germany. On the other side, you got the most incredible alpine panorama anywhere, the Eiger Monk and Jungfrau. And ahead of you, you hear the long legato tones of an Alphorn, announcing that the helicopter-stocked mountain hut is open, it's just around the corner, and the coffee schnapps is on. That's good travel. You come home and forever you're more clued into nature. It's a beautiful thing. Culture is another thing we gain an appreciation for in our travels. I'm just a cultural bumpkin from Seattle. I go to Europe and these guys are like they're evangelical about cheese. When I grew up, cheese was no big deal. It's orange in the shape of the bread. Here you go, cheese sandwich. And you go over there, and it's like a festival of mold when you step into these cheese shops. And this cheesemonger, he sees me. Oh, monsieur, come here, come here. And he takes me to the goat cheese corner, picks up a moldy wad of goat cheese, takes a deep whiff. Oh, smell this cheese. It smells like the feet of angels. It smells like the feet of baseball players to me, but it's okay. It's actually all right, you know. Now, I don't need to go home and be all crazy about stinky cheese and spend a lot of money buying that, but I do have that option. And it is good to know that some people are excited about stinky cheese. All over the world, there are people enthusiastic about things that we didn't know you could be enthusiastic about. As travelers, we can bring home, become a little hybrid that way, but it is good to know that different people have different passions. One great thing about travel is the people you meet, and it's clear to me, people carbonates your travel experience. That's the essence of good travel, is people to people. And when you travel, you meet people you wouldn't meet otherwise. It's really remarkable how many interesting people you can meet when you leave home. You know, we generally surround ourselves with people who are like us at home. It's a natural thing to do. It's very nice every once in a while to put yourself in a situation where you are not the norm, where people are staring at you because you're different. I find that stimulating. Now, these encounters don't need to be heavyweight. They can be kind of silly sometimes. I was in Italy recently, and this little kid was staring at me. It was kind of rude. Finally, his dad said, "Excuse my son, he stares at Americans." I said, "Well, what's with that?" He said, "Last week at McDonald's, we were having our hamburger, and my son, noticing the fluffy white bun, said, 'Dad, why do Americans have such soft bread?' And the dad said, 'Son, it's because Americans have no teeth.'" Now, I don't think the dad meant anything by that. It's just what dads do when they're out with the kid. They say nonsensical stuff to entertain themselves, and it confuses the child. And he was looking at tourists to see if we had teeth. I showed him mine to overcome that little bit of misunderstanding between people. But it's a reminder that there are silly misunderstandings between cultures that when we travel and meet each other, we can overcome. It's so important that we get out there and we humanize people that we might be afraid of otherwise. One of my favorite places to travel is Ireland. And I think in part because in Ireland, I have the sensation that I'm understanding a foreign language. The Irish people love to talk, and they got this great gift of gab. They've got a flowery, delightful, creative, entertaining way to talk. Now, my favorite part of Ireland is the far west of Ireland, areas called the Gaeltachts. These are national parks for the preservation of the traditional culture, where people are subsidized to live their traditional ways by their national government, and where people actually speak the old Irish instead of English. And there, it's way in the West Coast, where people stand on the bluff and they gaze out at the Atlantic and they say, the next parish over is Boston, okay? Now, when you go there, you'll meet people like this. Now, if you've got a busy list of sites today and you meet these guys and you get in a conversation, forget the sites. This is why you're in Ireland, to talk to these guys. And you get caught up in their wonderful art of conversation. I'll never forget talking to these guys. After a while, the guy on the left asked him, were you born here? He said, no, it's about 5 miles down the road. Later on, I asked him, have you lived here all your life? He said, not yet. You just get caught up in that. And this is the beauty. When you're traveling, find a way to meet people. It really makes the whole experience more vivid. Another great thing about travel is you gain an appreciation for history. It is more important than ever that we learn from history. I don't understand why our leaders and people that have very important decisions don't really respect history very much. For me, it's the greatest story to learn from. We're part of history. It's shaped who we are. We're shaping where it's going. It's happening all around us. And when you travel, you're more likely to realize that. I was in Berlin, for example, a few years ago on the opening day of their new Capitol building, the Reichstag. And this was very exciting. I mean, the Reichstag was full of history in the story of Germany in the last century. Of course, the last days of World War II were fought on the rooftop of this building, Soviets against Nazis. After the war, Germany is defeated, destroyed, it's divided. There's a no man's land with a wall right through Berlin and the bombed out hulk of their Capitol building there as the Berlin capital moves over to Bonn. After the Cold War is over, Germany's united, capital goes back to Berlin. They need a new Capitol building. In good European style, they don't bulldoze the bombed out hulk of their historic one, they renovate it. And they design into it a modern element, a beautiful glass dome. And I was there on opening day. It's free, it's designed primarily for German citizens, but tourists are more than welcome to walk up that spiral ramp to the very top and appreciate the architectural symbolism here. I mean, it's designed so that German citizens can literally look down over the shoulders of their legislators and see what's going on in their desks. They've been jerked around too much in the last century, and the German citizens are going to keep an eye on their legislators. I was on top of that dome on opening day, surrounded by teary-eyed Germans. Now, anytime you're surrounded by teary-eyed Germans, something exceptional is going on. And it occurred to me, wow. The opening of this great building is the symbolic closing of a difficult chapter in the history of a great nation. No more division, no more communism, no more fascism. A united government with a new Capitol building, starting a new century, looking into a promising future. It was exciting. I was caught up in it. And I looked around and I saw the other American tourists on the top of that dome that day. None of them had a clue. And it saddened me. I thought, I'm living in a dumbed-down society. I don't want to live in a dumbed-down society. And it occurred to me, there are powerful forces in our society that would find it convenient, profitable, if you and I were all just dumbed down. Just go shopping, we'll figure it out. We don't want to get into that situation. Germany has learned and paid a steep price for a dumbed-down electorate. And in Germany, I've noticed they invest in a smartened-up electorate. It's no political agenda, it's just good for everybody to have a smarter citizenry. I vowed then and there in my own work as a travel writer to expect my travelers to be engaged, to smarten them up. You make more money off of people when you just take them to the beach. Frequent flyer miles, duty-free shopping, fun in the sun, what's the power of your sunscreen? That's all fine and dandy, but if it bullies you out of a meaningful experience in your travels, you've lost something. It's a lost opportunity. I would think in all of our daily walks of life, it's important for us to expect our neighbors to be engaged, because the consequences are really tragic for a country when its electorate gets dumbed down. I was in Munich recently, and I saw this photograph, and it haunted me. This is 1932. These are people just like you and me, gathering together, listening to some charismatic politician trying to take them down his road. Looking at that crowd gave me the chills, because I know how a fascist leader with a lot of charisma can capitalize on people's fears and anguish and lead a society astray. We've learned it's not just Hitler and Germany. Most of Europe went down this road between the two world wars. What was the environment that made Hitler possible? Germany was humiliated in World War I. People were disillusioned. They felt insulted. They wanted to be made strong again, you know? It was the Depression, and people lost their jobs. People wanted a charismatic politician to promise them jobs. There was hardscrabble, downtrodden people who felt that immigrants and people from afar were cutting in front of them in line. There was scapegoating. There was blatant racism. There was a fear of communists, so the capitalist powers endorsed this sort of movement. There was an amazing ability to control the press and to manipulate people through propaganda. There were rallies. There were rallies that just amped up the base, and there was charismatic politicians who could tell lies repeatedly and so convincingly that people followed them. And then they had what every wannabe dictator gets, or dreams for, or prays for, and that is an excuse to turn that democracy into a law and order society, a police state. When you have a 9/11, it lets you circumvent civil liberties and assert your autocracy. In Germany, somebody burned down the Capitol building, and Hitler, from then on out, controlled the whole society. It was incremental, and then it snowballed. Turkey, same sort of thing with Erdogan. Incremental, failed coup, bam, dictator. We need to learn from history. Germany was bamboozled by a charismatic leader, and that country went right into a war that devastated Europe. Europe today is a result of the devastation of World War II. Can you imagine people gathered in the rubble of a bombed-out continent in the late 1940s, shaking their heads thinking, my goodness, we've bombed ourselves into rubble twice in this century. We've got to do something creative or our children are going to be digging out again. Europe got together and they decided we need to create a United States of Europe, a European Union, so that we can weave the economies of Germany and France together and another war would be inconceivable. It's a very interesting thing what they've done. You can complain about all the bureaucracy and the political correctness and the encumbrances of the European Union. But the triumph of the European Union, I believe, is that there will never be a great war in Europe again because France and Germany are woven together economically. And that alone, I think, is reason to celebrate the European Union. Now, the European Union, by the way, this is Verdun right here. And Verdun, it was just the battle zone where France and Germany just bashed their heads together mindlessly. Today, when you go back there, I was just there on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Verdun. What you see, along with the European flag, is the flag of Germany and France together. Brothers and sisters, not enemies, committed to the notion that we can never have another war like this. It's a beautiful thing when you think of how Europe has learned from its history. Now, along with becoming interwoven that way and avoiding future wars, the European Union has endeavored to create a free trade zone to compete with free trade zones like the United States and China. Now, when we think about the evolution of the European Union, it's been a clumsy, awkward evolution ever since the 1940s. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Every time they take 1 step back, we see headlines here in the United States and it seems that Europe's falling apart. But Europe has come a long way. It's a tough sell to give proud nations, to get them to give away sovereignty in the interest of real union, but that's what you got to do. You got to give up sovereignty, and Europe is here to stay. The question is, how big will it be, how will it be run, and so on. That remains to be seen. But when we think about Europe, it has created an economic free trade zone to compete with the United States. And when you put it in relative terms, Europe produces $16 trillion of stuff a year, with, in the west of Europe, about 400 million people. In the United States, with 300 million people, produces about the same $16 trillion of stuff a year. A lot of Americans who are threatened, I think, by Europe's social sensibilities, will put that economic system down by saying, look, it takes them 400 million people to produce $16 trillion, and we can do it with 300 million people. We produce more per person. Well, that's true. But if that person was going to give you an honest and complete assessment, they would also say, But the European worker chooses to work about 25% fewer hours and willingly makes 25% less stuff so they can spend more time with their family. It's not a right or wrong. You know, everybody has the right to choose how they want to organize their society. And I'm certainly thankful that I run my business here in the United States as an entrepreneur. I can turn on a dime, I can employ people efficiently, I can produce great stuff, I think, for a great price and still make a lot of money. That's the American system, and I think it's a real blessing in a lot of ways, but we can learn from Europe. It's the annoying thing about going to Europe is you realize they work hard, but they also play a lot. I mean, I was in Amsterdam, and I was just doing my research work, and I came upon a rental party boat filled with people on a Wednesday afternoon. These are not students. These are grown adults. I thought, maybe there's a festival I should know about. I should ask them what's going on. Hi, what you doing? And they said, it's Wednesday afternoon. We get together with our mates, we cut out of work early, you want to join us? We're having a party. I just thought, this is annoying. What about the work ethic? And then I remembered, and it occurred to me just recently, the work ethic. Were we raised saying a work ethic or the work ethic? The. There's only one. You work hard. We Americans have the shortest vacations in the rich world. Our friends in Europe look at us and shake their heads thinking, what's with you guys, working yourself so frantically into an early grave? What's it all worth? But we don't even question that. It is a work ethic. My Norwegian relatives do not have the American work ethic. They have a different work ethic. So I think it's just important to remember, it's not right or wrong, but we have a work ethic, not the work ethic. When you travel in Europe, you're going to see a lot of demonstrations, and this can be unnerving to a lot of American travelers. What's going on? Well, they've got the same challenges we've got. Refugees, immigrants, frustrations because of budgetary concerns. What are you going to do with your entitlements? There's a lot of demonstrations in Europe because of entitlement reform. Now, Europe has entitlements that make our entitlements look really stingy. I mean, Europe's entitlements are lavish. I mean, this is ridiculous. They get health care, they get education, they get retirements. I mean, it's enough to really be frustrating. And those entitlements were instituted a long time ago when Europe was a very young society. A lot of people working, not a lot of people retiring, and those who retired didn't live very long after that. And these entitlements were so successful, so sustainable, so impressive, that they created a situation where there's a different demographic makeup now. When a society becomes wealthy and well-educated, two things happen. They live longer, and they have fewer kids. So in Europe, now you have a geriatric society. It used to be a pyramid-shaped demographic mix with a lot of people working. Now it's an inverted pyramid with a relatively few people working, lots more people living to retirement, and those who do just live way too long after that. Now, the unfortunate lot in life for a politician in Europe is to stand before their workers and say, sorry, we have to change the arithmetic here. It just doesn't add up anymore. You don't get the promise. Your parents got it. Your friend who retired 5 years ago got it, but you've got to work an extra 5 years. That's enough to really anger people. That's enough for people to get out in the streets and demonstrate. The workers go on the rampage. La manifestation, they call it in France. Well, I think it's a healthy way for a society to vent during complicated and frustrating times. They get out and they march. Again, we have the same frustrations too here in the United States, but all that marching is just way too much exercise. So as a society, I think what we do to vent is we go home and find a TV network that affirms our frustrations, and then we just shake our hands in unison, all right? I think it's the same dynamic. If you find these TV stations either on the left or the right, it's an alternative to actually getting out there and marching. Europeans march. What I'm saying is, don't shy away from Europe just because people are marching in the streets. It's healthy, it's part of their democracy. Big news in Europe in our lifetime is the end of the Cold War, the falling apart of the Soviet Union, and the Warsaw Pact basically switching from communism to capitalism and joining the European Union. Overnight, 100 million people went from being communists to being capitalists. It's really quite a striking event. And when we travel today, we go into Eastern Europe and it just feels like a festival of pent-up entrepreneurial spirit. Of course, there's lots of struggles in Eastern Europe and so on, but in historical terms, times are great in Eastern Europe, and they are working hard and they are thriving. They've got the same infrastructure in the East now as the West, and the whole economy is almost there. This shot here reminds me of how Eastern Europe is just feeling really energized. This is in Krakow in Poland, and it reminds me during the bleakest times of communism. It was such a demoralizing situation with these governments completely ignoring the laws of supply and demand and so on, that if you were lucky enough to own a car in Poland, for instance, you would actually take your windshield wipers in with you at night. Why? Because they had this clueless command economy ignoring the laws of supply and demand. Somebody upstairs forgot to order windshield wipers. Demand exceeds supply. Thieves get wind of that and common sense steal the wipers at night and sell them for a fortune on the black market in the morning. That's how a black market happens, is when you circumvent the laws of supply and demand. Of course, today in Eastern Europe, the laws of supply and demand are kicking in. There's more than enough windshield wipers produced and distributed to meet the demand, and people in Warsaw are leaving their wipers on their car all night long. It's an amazing time to be in Eastern Europe and to celebrate this. Something that I just love about Europe is the diversity. Now, you'd think as Europe is uniting, the diversity would melt away, wouldn't you? And everything would be like a strip mall. But the counterintuitive result of the unification of Europe is more, not less, ethnic diversity. Let me explain why. In Europe, there are 3 levels of loyalty: the region, the nation, and Europe. If you have a friend in Munich and you ask him where he's from, he might say, I'm Bavarian and proud of it. Or I'm German, or I'm a European. If you have a friend in Barcelona, he very likely would say, I'm Catalonian, but he might say, I'm Spanish, and he might say, I'm European. If you look at any city hall in Europe these days, you will see 3 flags. One for the region, Scotland, one for the country, Great Britain, and one for Europe. Now, the headlines in our lifetime have been regions challenging nations, right? Regions wanting more autonomy and nations threatened by that. As Europe unites, the nations realize that they're going to be less of a player in the future. Europe is favoring the ethnic regions, and the regions are waving their flags with more freedom and more vigor. All over, we see this dynamic playing out, and it's quite exciting. Edinburgh, for the first time since the 1700s, just a couple decades ago, got its own parliament building. And in Edinburgh, not in London. In fact, a couple of years ago, London gave Scottish people the opportunity to vote if they wanted to be independent or not. Just that was quite a statement for independence for Scotland. Here's that ATM machine, language buttons in Barcelona. If you went to Barcelona and wanted to change money, the top 4 buttons are Spanish languages. Fascinating to think that there are 4 different languages in Spain. On the top left, you would find Catalan. That's for the local people in Catalonia. Across from that, you've got Español for most Spanish speakers. Below Catalan is Gallego for the people of Galicia, northwestern Spain, who speak their own language. And then across from that is Euskara, which is for the Basque people, all languages within Spain. Now, after that, you see a button for the German speakers, the French, the English, and in the bottom left, one for everybody else. If you were to go to Basque country, you would find the same 4 buttons on top. Not because Catalonians couldn't speak English or Espanol to get their money out of that cash machine, but as a matter of solidarity for their fellow victims of the tyranny of the majority, the people in Catalonia, right? They really appreciate each other's struggles when it comes to being what they call a nation without a state. I was recently in Barcelona. I was trying to sort stuff out, and I was saying, okay, so you're a region of Spain, right? No, we're not a region of Spain. We are a nation without a state. When they drew the lines, they ignored us. When they drew the line between France and Spain, there's a bunch of Basque-speaking people. What about us? You guys learn to speak French, and you guys learn to speak Spanish, you know? Well, that festers. You can draw those lines, but centuries later, you're going to be dealing with the problems as we've seen, and we're seeing right now with what's going on in Catalan. So it's exciting in our travels to be tuned into that. And it's exciting to remember that these days, the little languages are more widely spoken today than they were a generation ago. When you go to Barcelona today, you'll find the kids are speaking Catalan first, and they learn Spanish as a second language in school. Just a generation ago, Catalan was outlawed. You couldn't dance the sacred sardana dance outside of the cathedral on Sunday after Mass. And you couldn't even wave your Catalonian flag. Of course, now you can do all of that. So Europe has come a long way in that regard. This man is named Armin Walsh. He's a friend of mine who's sort of the Indiana Jones of Tyrolean archaeologists, okay? And he's got these schemes where he wants to renovate these old medieval castles and make museums so people know more about the Tyrolean heritage. Takes a lot of money. When he needs money, he does not go to Vienna because he won't get any money. He'll go to Brussels. And he doesn't go to Brussels and say, I got a great idea for Austria, because he'd go home empty-handed. He says, I've got a great idea for the Tyrol, and Brussels gives him money. Brussels funds the ethnic regions more than the political states with border lines drawn after wars to keep various powers happy. Because Brussels is smart. It is ethnic sectarian squabbling within fake borders that causes so many of the problems in our world today. Look what's happening in the Mediterranean basin. You got Libya, you got Iraq, you got Syria. The way I understand it, all countries created by European colonial powers who drew nonsense lines in the sand, ignoring ethnic realities. And then the only way those false countries can stay together is with a strong-armed dictatorship. Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Assad, right? 100 years later, we get on this democracy kick, and we say, you can't have a strong-arm leader, so we get rid of him. Well, that's nice if it would work, but the fact is then you got the reality underlying that is these are nonsense states and they fall apart. And today we've got literally millions of refugees because of that knocking at the door of Europe. These are important issues, and Europe is smart in recognizing in the long term, you've got to honor the ethnicities in Europe. It's a fun thing to follow in our travels. In the European Union, you have a situation where it's all for one and one for all. And rich countries give more than they take out, and poor countries take out more than they put in. When it comes to investing in the infrastructure, the rich countries subsidize the poor countries. Do you remember when the United States, when the United States built the interstate system? Rich states and poor states all got the same quality roads, paid for by federal taxes. Rich states were subsidizing poor states. When I first started traveling in Europe, the 4 poor countries, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, none of them had any freeways. Today, they're laced by German quality, beautiful freeways. And when you look at a new freeway here in Ireland, you will generally see a sign with a European flag on it that says, this project has received 85% financial assistance from the European Union. That means Germany and France paid for this freeway, and you Irish people got to stop drinking so much Guinness, get out of the pub and work, because we got to keep up with the United States of America. So it's exciting to see Europe investing in itself and moving forward. One of the joys of travel is to use this infrastructure. This is the great train station, the Hauptbahnhof in Berlin. It's just breathtaking. Just to ride the trains in Europe, for me, is a thrill. I was recently in the train station in Munich taking pictures of trains coming into the station, specifically taking pictures of what used to be cute little birds squished onto the windshield. Oh, yeah, I know it's terrible. Let me give you a closer look. When I looked at that little bird, I thought 2 things. First of all, I thought, man, this is a dangerous continent if you're a slow bird. And secondly, I thought, this is a surreal image. I don't know about trains where you live, but in Seattle where I live, you would never see a bird squished to the windshield of a train because it was going so fast. I could imagine a bird sitting on a folding chair on the rooftop with a cigar and a cocktail enjoying the ride, but not squished to the windshield. Trains are going faster and faster in Europe because they're investing in their infrastructure like you can't imagine. All my life I've been going to Greece, and when I get to the Gulf of Corinth, I just get on a funky little ferry to go across that body of water. A few years ago I came there and I had a double take. Where's the ferry? It's gone. There's this big fancy bridge. And I thought, that's not a Greek bridge. That's a German bridge that somehow landed in Greece. What's going on with this? Well, it was probably built with German money. Why? So German trucks filled with their gummy bears could get over that bottle of water and get into the Peloponnesian Peninsula and make the sail. That's the rationale for all of this investment. It is trade, and Europe is really into that free trade within the European zone. And today, as tourists in Europe, we get to travel freely also throughout that vast free trade zone called the European Union. When I think back on my youth, I remember thinking of the world as a pyramid with the United States on top and everybody else trying to figure it out. And believe it or not, until well into my adulthood, I believed that if some other country didn't get it, we had the right, because we care, to go in there and give them a government that did understand it correctly. Well, of course, now I've traveled and I've hung out with enough people that have put me in my place, and I realize that everybody has a different approach to similar problems, and there are different solutions. When you travel, it's humbling. We have the 4th of July. It doesn't mean anything over there. In Switzerland, you've got August 1st. In Norway, it's May 17. In France, it's 10 days after our holiday, Bastille Day, July 14. When we travel, we realize we have the American dream. Maybe they don't. It's not an insult to our dream to think that the people of Sri Lanka have a different dream, because they do. My Norwegian relatives, they don't have the American dream, they've got the Norwegian dream. My Bulgarian friends, they've got the Bulgarian dream. And as we travel, we get to celebrate that. When we travel, we gain an appreciation of how much pride and how much spine there is in this beautiful world of ours. I traveled across Asia several times, and a long time ago I was in Afghanistan. I'll never forget sitting down at the cafeteria in Kabul and just minding my own business as a backpacker going across that country. And I was joined by a local man, and he just sat down and he said, "Can I join you?" I said, "You already have." He said, "Are you an American?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm a professor here in Afghanistan, and I want you to know that 1/3 of the people on this planet eat with spoons and forks like you do. 1/3 of the people eat with chopsticks, and 1/3 of the people on this planet eat with their fingers like I do, and we're all civilized just the same." I still remember how he said it, "and we're all civilized just the same." I thought, boy, you got a chip on your shoulder about this, you know? And later on I went on and I thought about it, and I realized he was right. I thought less of him because he ate with his fingers. And I thought, okay, across South Asia, I'm gonna go local, and I'm gonna eat with my fingers. And I went into fancy restaurants all over India, filled not with tourists, but with professional local people who had plenty of money, who had no silverware in that restaurant, just a ceremonial sink. They would wash their hands before dinner, and they'd use their fingers for what God intended them to be used for, to nourish them. After a while, it actually felt right. It became natural for me. In fact, I had to be retrained when I got home. It's just kind of humbling. Later on another trip, I was in Eastern Turkey with one of our tour groups. I love taking groups around Eastern Turkey. And we went into this dusty village, and I think we were the first group that ever went there. And it was big news. And the mayor took us on a tour. He took us into his house. We were all dancing like they do in Turkey. And I was the big shot because I was the tour guide. He said, "Come with me." And he took me over to the most holy place in his house. It was his Quran bag, where he hung his Quran. And he said, "In my Quran bag, I also have a copy of the Torah and the Bible, because we're all people of the book, children of the same God." And I just thought, these are moments that I wish more people could have. They really are. Later on, we went to the wood carver shop. He was the big shot in this village. He was the man, the best known guy in the region. Everybody wanted a prayer niche carved by this guy. We gathered around his work table, and he was working away, showing off, really puffed up, you know. Suddenly, he stopped. He held his chisel high into the sky, and he declared, "A man and his chisel, the greatest factory on earth." I thought, wow, I don't need to encourage this man to go to night school and become computer literate. You know, he's contributing, he's confident, he's doing what he's meant to do. Later on, I asked him if I could buy some of his carving. And he said, "No, for a man my age to know that some of my work will go back to the United States of America and be appreciated, that is payment enough. Take this as a gift from me to you, and when you get home, remember our village." So beautiful. This is the kind of magical little souvenirs you bring home when you travel. I was on another trip in Turkey in the shadow of Mount Ararat. We were tooling around looking for something interesting. We came upon a stadium filled with high school kids. Stop the bus, go in, see what's happening. 200 kids having some kind of a rally, singing in unison, thrusting their fists up in the sky and singing, "We are a secular nation. We are a secular nation." I asked my guide, "What's going on here? Don't they like God?" And she said, "Oh no, we love God, but considering the rising tide of Islamic fundamentalism just over the border to the east, we're very concerned about the fragile and precious separation of mosque and state here in our country, and we're having a pep rally for secularism." A pep rally for secularism at a high school in Eastern Turkey. Who'd have thunk? What a treat to be able to go into there and experience that. There are these challenges all over our world right now. In Turkey right now, they've got a major threat to that pluralism and that secularism. And to watch that and to know the struggles and the passions and the reality of that, it's just so poignant. I grew up thinking Nathan Hale and Patrick Henry and Ethan Allen were the ultimate. Great patriots. I was so inspired. They only wish they had more than one life to give for their country, you know? And then you travel and you realize there's a lot of Nathan Hales on this planet. Valiant patriots that wish they could give more than one life for their country. And it's really constructive and healthy for us to recognize that in our travels. And I think a good thing to do in your travels is try to get your brain around a contemporary Nathan Hale, a Nelson Mandela, a Lech Walesa, Archbishop Oscar Romero, and get caught up in that struggle. It's really instructive. A very good example is Archbishop Oscar Romero. Remember a long time ago they had the Civil War in Central America, the Sandinistas and the Contras, and the United States was involved in this, and it was framed for all of us, and I completely bought it, that this was communism against capitalism and its freedom and so on. I went down to Central America on several trips over the years with educational tour companies to learn about this in person from south of the border, and it occurred to me, no, it wasn't as simple as capitalism against communism. There was an oligarchy of 3 or 4 families in El Salvador that effectively owned all of the arable land. If you're a rich elite in a banana republic like El Salvador and you own all this land, are you going to grow rice and beans to feed your poverty-stricken peasantry? Or are you going to get a reasonable return on your land by growing fancy stuff to export north to the United States? Of course, you're going to grow the fancy stuff for export. What happens is, eventually, there's almost no land left for peasants to grow rice and beans. The peasants have no alternative but to work on the plantation, and they have to, with their plantation wages, buy imported food from the United States from the commissary. They get it coming and going. That's called cash cropping, and that's called structural poverty. It's fascinating to go down there and study it from that perspective. You know, it's interesting in the Bible, it says in the Old Testament, in the Jubilee year, every 50 years you're supposed to redivide the land and forgive the debts. It says it in the Bible. Every 50 years you're supposed to forgive the debts and redistribute the land. Now, rich Christians know God must have been kidding. This is just nonsense. But I think there's some common sense to that, because it takes about 50 years for things to get so out of whack that the rich elites who have no end of their greed get a situation where there's no middle class, there's so much desperation down here and so much unthinkable wealth up there, that these people have to rise up violently just to get some dignity. And if you look at Central American history, every 50 years, there's what I call a Jubilee massacre. 1830s, peasants rise up, slam down. 1880s, peasants rise up, slam down. 1930s, same thing, and then in our memory, 1980s. Peasants rose up and slammed down. Archbishop Oscar Romero stood with the landless peasants. He said, I'll probably be assassinated, but I'll rise again in my people. He was assassinated, and he rose again in his people. It's so amazing to witness that, to go down there in person and understand and empathize with these struggles. These are real struggles. Much later, I was due for a vacation in Mazatlan. I was frazzled, I was burned out, and I needed a family vacation. I was fantasizing about a pristine stretch of tropical beach, swept free of local riffraff, just me and my rich white friends. It was going to be wonderful. We're going to have plastic straps on our wrists, didn't even dirty our fingers in the local currency, all the margaritas we wanted. It was going to be a nice vacation. And then my friend said, Rick, it's the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero. We're going to go to San Salvador and march with the locals. Do you want to join us? I told my family, I'm not going to be any fun on the beach. I needed to go to El Salvador. This is perverse. This is so weird that an American would trade a vacation on the beach in Mazatlan to march with peasants in San Salvador. But you know, it was the most beautiful travel experience I've ever had. It was cheaper than Mazatlan, perfectly safe, and it was life-changing. 2 days into that trip, I realized I'm so thankful I'm here. I was covered with bug bites, sleeping in a sweaty dorm, eating rice and beans one day and beans and rice the next. But I was with the people of El Salvador, gaining an appreciation of their reality. We marched, and I'll never forget, in their capital city, marching with tens of thousands of Salvadorans, came to this monument. And I thought, now wait a minute. That's my monument. That's our monument. This is the Vietnam Memorial. What's it doing here in El Salvador? They said, well, it's your design. We took it, okay. But this is our monument, and there's just as many names chiseled into the black granite here as on your monument, but these are 50,000 people who died fighting the United States of America. Here we have a little country of 5 million people that lost as many people as we lost in the Vietnam War. That's a 40 to 1 ratio of heartache. And think of the impact the Vietnam War had on our society. And think of the baggage in El Salvador when they lost that many people over this fight for land rights. That's baggage, isn't it? And it occurred to me when I went to this wall, there's baggage here. And I've thought a lot about baggage because I am fascinated by how our country has been burdened by the baggage of 9/11. When I was a kid, it was Depression-era baggage, it was German and Japanese baggage, Red Scare baggage, Vietnam baggage. Now it's 9/11 baggage. 15 years ago, we lost 2,800 people. And frankly, it changed who we are as a nation. We're a different nation. We torture people now. Not because we want to torture people, because we were hit, and we have to do it because we care about our security, or whatever the excuse is. We've got the political situation we have today, I think, because of 9/11. Now, that's baggage. Okay, we want people to give us a little slack and understanding because of our baggage. I think we should give other people a little understanding because of their baggage. Because I would bet most nations have heavier baggage than we have, but we don't really acknowledge it. Iran, there's a country with some baggage. I had the great challenge and honor of going to Iran a few years ago with our public television film crew to humanize 70 million Iranians, to understand how could they vote for a guy like Ahmadinejad. What is their baggage? What makes them tick? It was a great experience. People ask me, why are you going to Iran? Well, I thought, well, it's good style to know people before you bomb them. Sometimes you have to bomb people, but it should hurt, and I wanted to know who these people were, and I wanted to know how they could vote for what seemed like a buffoon, Ahmadinejad. It's curious, isn't it? I wanted to go there. Who is his base? Who is his base? What do we know about Iran? I'm a pretty well-educated guy. Everything I knew about Iran, I learned from Ted Koppel. That's pretty pathetic, really. It's pretty pathetic. So we ventured over to Iran. I was a little nervous. What was our reception going to be like? We almost left our big camera in Athens and decided to take the little camera, the little sneak camera, because we thought they'd be throwing stones at an American film crew on the streets of Tehran. I'm so glad we brought in our big camera, because I honestly have never been received so warmly on the streets of any city that I've worked as when I was in Tehran. It blew me away. Now, you've got this odd situation of incredible friendliness and hateful propaganda. An 8-story tall propaganda mural of our flag with dropping bombs for stripes and skulls for stars. Imagine, as an American, walking underneath that. Awkward. Awkward. But it occurred to me, everybody I saw on the street wasn't even born when this was painted, and they've got a dictatorship, they can't challenge the existence of that. And the friendliness just confused me. Hateful propaganda, super friendly people. I was caught in a traffic jam on this very street that day. It was just silent. And finally, the man in the next car went like this, rolled down your window to my driver. I'll never forget this. He handed over a bouquet of flowers, and he said, "Give this to the foreigner in your back seat and apologize for our traffic." I don't know about where you live, but in Seattle, that never happens on the freeway. It just never happens. Later on, I was in another traffic jam. It was just quiet. And suddenly, our driver just blurted out, he said, "Death to traffic." I said, "Now wait a minute, I thought it was death to Israel or death to America." And he said, "Well, right now it's death to traffic." I said, "What is this with you Iranians, all this death too, you know?" And he said, "Well, here in Iran, when something is frustrating us and out of our control, we say death to that." So I thought about it, and I thought, he doesn't speak very good English. He's translating stuff in a stilted way. What is he really saying? Death to. Damn. He's saying, damn the traffic. Damn election fraud. Damn Ahmadinejad. Damn Obama, whatever. Death, you know, how do you translate it? Well, he's trying to translate it death too. Now, have I ever thought, damn somebody? Have I ever thought, damn those teenagers? Well, sure I have. Do I really want them to die and burn in hell for an eternity? Not yet. But it's after midnight, turn down the music. death to teenagers. So I'm just saying it behooves us to have a little more nuanced understanding of what societies angry and frustrated are trying to tell us when they translate something that is more complicated than a bumper sticker. And when you travel, you meet these people and you find that out, and they say damn to a lot of things, all right? I don't want to apologize for the bad things Iran does, but it is worth us getting a better understanding by traveling there and getting to know these people. So I had the opportunity to go there and make this show. I'm so thankful that it could air on public television, because it wouldn't air anywhere else in the dial, I can promise you that. And we were able to try to understand the baggage of Iran. What's it like? What really challenges them? And they're not living in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, that's for sure. What challenges them is incursions from the West. In 1953, they had a democratically elected prime minister who was apparently quite a popular local guy, Mossadegh, and he nationalized their oil. You cannot nationalize your oil if you're in the developing world. And Britain and America orchestrated a coup and threw him out and put the Shah on the throne. And now we had somebody reasonable who we could negotiate with to get our hands on that oil. Well, you know, oil, all that kind of stuff, for the local people, that was beyond them. They just had a puppet of American values on the throne in Tehran. And for a whole generation, these people in the big city were bragging that the miniskirts are shorter in Tehran than they are in Paris. This was American values on their throne. And when you talk about regime change, that's quite a challenge to people who care about these values, and we really have a tough time understanding how important those values are. Another incursion from the West was the Iran-Iraq War. They lost a couple 100,000 people in the 1980s when they were invaded by Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, funded by the United States. Now, maybe we don't like to think that we funded him, and maybe we don't believe we funded him, but most people understand we did, and Iran suffered. Incursion from the West. And when you go to Iran today, every town has what they call a martyr's cemetery, a vast martyr's cemetery. And it's alive with grief today as it was 25 years ago. It's amazing to me. And if you go to a martyr's cemetery in Iran, and you see a woman who every Friday, for 25 years of Friday, has gone to the tomb of her husband and wept, that's baggage. And there's 200,000 of those mothers. So we need to understand that. We don't need to justify it. We just need to appreciate it. On the last day of my shoot, I was just doing some work on a street, and a well-dressed professional woman came across the street, and she said, "Are you an American journalist?" I said, "Yes." And she did one of these things with her finger on my chest. "I want you to go home and tell the truth. We're strong, we're united, and we just don't want our little girls to be raised like Britney Spears." I said, "We got something in common here. Let's talk, you know?" And right there, it was coming together. Why did 51% of Iran, not the big city elites, who was Ahmadinejad's base? Who voted for this guy? That just seems so loony. Who voted for him? Small town, less educated fundamentalists. Think about it. Ahmadinejad's base. Small town, less educated fundamentalists. Good people, I want to stress, good people, riddled with fear and driven by love. This is really important to appreciate as we try to figure out what's going on this planet. And you don't know that unless you travel, that's for sure. I love our idea of liberty. But there are places that say, you know, we got liberty too. In fact, the hometown of Salvador Dali apparently has double the liberty. All over Europe, you find people celebrating their culture and their liberty. I'm just a real sucker for how different societies make sure that the traditions are sent from generation to generation. It's worked into the festivals. A little town in northern Italy has a festival every summer where the older kids teach the younger kids how to make a good ravioli. A little town in France, in Burgundy, where they make great wine, the Chamber of Commerce has gathered its money together and produced these beautiful orbs so visitors can enjoy and appreciate the fine difference in the bouquet of the different wines they produce in that valley. Apparently a good nose is a life skill worth investing in that part of France. I like going to towns where people enthusiastically pay too much for their loaf of bread in order to buy it from the person who baked it. I think here in the United States, a lot of times we're inclined to be efficient. You'd save a lot of money and a lot of time going to the store if you just had a freezer in your garage, and you could stock it up and go to a big box store. In Europe, they have a different passion. They manage to have a little tiny refrigerator under their sink, so every morning they have to go to the market to check in with their neighbors and pay too much for that loaf of bread. Again, it's a choice a society makes, and I can be inspired by it. Europeans love their fine wine, and they know where to fill it up really cheap. The cheapest liquid you can buy in the Mediterranean part of the world is table wine. And they've actually got literal filling stations where people a couple of times a year drive up with all their empty jugs and fill her up. I'm fascinated by how in the United States we seem so eager to have to legislate morality. Have you ever thought about that? In Europe, my friends tell me a society has to make a choice: tolerate alternative lifestyles or build more prisons. And then they always remind me with that annoying little statistic, and you Americans lock up 10 times as many people per capita as we do. Either you are an inherently more criminal people, or there's something screwy about your laws. Now, we're all moral people here, and I would imagine everybody in this room has a different morality. And if one person here was able to say, my morality is the law of the land, that might impinge on a few other people. So a society has to kind of finesse that. To what degree are you going to have your morality part of the land, you see? And in the United States, I think we're going in the wrong direction. We already have a mass incarceration problem, and we're going in the wrong direction. When you go around Europe, you find that Europe is motivated not by moralizing and incarceration, but by what they call pragmatic harm reduction. Pragmatic harm reduction. We're struggling with the same challenges on both sides of the Atlantic, and we address them in two different ways. Prostitution's interesting. Nobody would say prostitution's a healthy thing. It's going to happen anywhere, regardless of how strict the laws are. In the United States, we have lots of crime and violence and disease associated with it. In Europe, they want to address those challenges and take that out of the equation. In Europe, you have legal brothels. It doesn't mean they're endorsing that. They're saying pragmatic harm reduction. The sex workers in Frankfurt or in Amsterdam are going to be licensed, and they get their license by going to a doctor and make sure they're not spreading diseases. The notion is if they get a dangerous client and they push their emergency buzzer, they're not rescued by a pimp, but they're rescued by the policeman. Now, it doesn't work out quite that nice, but that's the sort of the hope. And they're struggling with it that way, and it's certainly an interesting tourist attraction if you happen to be walking down that street. Another interesting challenge is drug policy. Of course, marijuana is a big discussion in our country, and we're starting to make some headway on breaking down the prohibition against marijuana in our country, and we've learned a lot from Europe. In Europe, a joint is about as exciting as a can of beer. And my European friends have challenged me with this notion that more people are going to smoke if the laws become more loose. Because Europeans know that the country with the loosest laws on marijuana anywhere in Europe, the Netherlands, smokes less than the European average. And Europeans smoke less than we do per capita, and you can do a hard time for it here in the United States. Europeans remind me that there's not a reservoir of decent people that would love to ruin their lives smoking pot if only it was legal. People who want to smoke pot do. It can be an illegal activity that fuels a black market, that empowers organized crime and gangs, or it can be a highly regulated and highly taxed legal market. By the way, I was one of the co-sponsors and the funders and spokespeople of our I-502 law in Washington State, where we legalized marijuana. And marijuana was a black market industry that was rivaling apples in my state. That's a big deal. And today, my governor is getting $300 million a year in tax revenue because we've legalized tax and regulated marijuana. Now, you might think, well, that's because everybody's smoking pot now. No, statistically, there's been no change. You've just taken a big black market and taken the money out of that and put it into a legal industry. The track record's in right now. We did this on a hunch 4 or 5 years ago, but now we know when you legalize smartly, use stays essentially the same. Teen use does not go up. DUIs do not go up, and crime doesn't go up. The only thing that goes up is tax revenue and mature adults who want to exercise the civil liberty of enjoying recreational marijuana. Now, in Europe, you'll find that there are different ways to deal with this challenge in different countries. And as a person who has an interest in any kind of these sort of challenges, you go over there and you talk to people, and it's a fascinating dimension of your travels. Hard drugs is another story. We have an opioid crisis in our country. Europe has an opioid challenge in their countries. I was in a restaurant recently in Switzerland. I went downstairs to the men's room, stepped in, blue lights. Blue lights, what's going on? You can't see your veins when there's blue lights. They've got a lot of drug addicts on the streets in Switzerland, and they don't want them into their restrooms shooting up to get out of the weather. It just makes their clients uncomfortable. So you put the blue lights there. And anywhere in Europe, if you go to a troubled neighborhood or an area where there's a lot of junkies, you'll find blue lights. Doesn't mean there's more junkies. A lot of my tourists will say, look at these liberal Europeans, there's more addicts. No, they're just still alive and they're not in jail. They've got the same amount here and there, you see. In Europe, the word for addicted in many languages is enslaved. It's fascinating. These are not criminals. These are sick people. Drug addicts don't need lawyers and cops and judges. They need counselors and nurses. They need compassion. It's fascinating to me how we can't figure that out here in our society. Across the street from that restaurant, bolted to a bridge, was a machine that used to sell cigarettes. Now it's been rejiggered and it sells government-subsidized syringes, almost free, 2 for $1. Now, in the United States, you might say, you're not going to give these people needles. That's just endorsing this horrible activity. No, that's moralizing. Pragmatic harm reduction. They're going to be swapping needles. Do you want them to be sharing diseases, you know? No, give them the needles. And then down the street, where the tourists don't go, you find a very sad scene. It's a cafe fix, where heroin addicts go to be counseled and to have oversight while they administer their addiction. In Switzerland, where they have these heroin maintenance clinics, they do not have heroin overdose deaths. We have something like tens of thousands of deaths every year. We lose 3 or 4 times the people per capita that Europe does on heroin overdoses. We need to challenge ourselves to think out of the box, to get pragmatic, I think, about some of these very, very persistent and heartbreaking challenges. It's so interesting in your travels, if you like, you get exposed to these issues. I've been talking about all sorts of issues you wouldn't find in a normal travel magazine, you know, but it can be part of your travels. I am fascinated by the twin societies of the United States and Europe. There are clearly differences, but we really are very much the same at the same time. What are the differences? When you think about it, we're both affluent, Christian, pluralistic, capitalistic democracies. We're all about government by, for, and of the people. But there is a difference. It's occurred to me lately that we in the United States are government by, for, and of the people via the corporations that we own. It's not a judgmental statement. It's just, as a society, we are deciding now that the role of government is to create a nice environment for our corporations to prosper and then get out of the way, and then we'll all be better off because we all own these corporations. In Europe, it's different. It's government by, for, and of the people in spite of the interests of the corporations that they own. They're not less capitalistic. I think they're just a little more honest about accounting, because conventional accounting doesn't really do it. And these days, corporations have a legal obligation to profit maximize in the short term. That's it. A legal obligation to profit maximize in the short term. That is not sustainable, and that's where the European governments come in to help moderate and to help blow the whistle on things that are not sustainable and call people who are causing a problem that won't be paid for now, but somebody else is going to be left holding the bag 10 years from now. That might not be good for business right now, and it's certainly not good for your quarterly profit statement, but in Europe, the populace make sure the government is there to make sure this is done for the well-being of the society at large. It's a challenge for us, and we can learn from our European friends. I've got friends all over Europe that can be my sounding boards. I really appreciate that. One of my favorites is a school teacher in Switzerland named Ollie. Ollie is a school teacher in a little town high in the Swiss Alps where everybody has the same last name. It's a humble little town. And Ollie and his wife Maria are so much fun to sit down and talk with. Recently, I was staying in their B&B, and I asked Ollie, how can you Swiss people so docilely pay such high taxes? And without missing a beat, I'll never forget this, Ollie just said, well, what's it worth to live in a society where there's no hunger and no homelessness, and where everybody, regardless of how wealthy their parents are, have access to quality health care and education? To me, to him it was common sense. And he is not even a considered a progressive guy in his community. He's sort of a conservative, stable, guy in the community, but that's just the European sensibility. It's an affluent society. They got a safety net for people that don't play the capitalist game very much, and they really recognize the value of a strong and healthy and well-educated middle class. When we travel, we realize that we Americans are compassionate people, but we're not very good at dealing honestly with the gap between rich and poor. And when you travel, you're more aware of the gap between rich and poor in our country as well as the gap between us and the developing world. There's just an interesting fact that I just cannot get away from. Half of humanity is trying to live on $2 a day. That's just a fact. Half of humanity is trying to live on $2 a day. 1 billion people are trying to live on $1 a day. When you travel with your window down and your heart open, you see it. It's there. It's not a guilt trip. It's just reality. We're wealthy. They're desperate. All right? And how are we? What is our involvement in that? I like to travel because when I leave our country, I feel I can see it in a different perspective. I can sometimes learn more about my country by leaving it and looking at it from afar. I can see our challenges and our shortcomings in high contrast. And also when I go to another country, I can see there what happens if we don't deal with our problems and they continue to get worse, because you can see them in the extreme in this struggling land. One thing I've learned in my travels is even if you're motivated only by greed, if you know what's good for you, you don't want to be filthy rich in a desperately poor society. It's just not a nice place to raise your kids. You find it. I mean, you go to Central America, any middle-class community has to pool its resources to hire an armed guard so the kids can go to the park. You go to Central America, every pharmacy, every bank, every hotel has an armed guard. We're going to be seeing more and more armed guards in our society. And it's a symptom of not lawlessness, it's a symptom of a gap between rich and poor. That's the challenge we have. When you travel, you see beautiful children. And we're all just suckers for children, I love my little girl so much. And I look at these little girls, they're just as deserving. They're just as precious. And their moms abandon them every day to walk for water and walk for firewood. That's just the reality for the average little girl or little boy living in a barrio like this. It occurred to me, my daughter had $5,000 for braces and money left over for white teeth, whitener. And I realized every kid in her classroom apparently could scrape together $5,000 so they could have straight teeth with money left over for whitener. Now, that's right. That's not a guilt trip. We have a winning system. We work hard. Our kids get straight teeth. But for the cost of 2 sets of braces, you could drill a well in a thirsty community, and all those moms could stay home. Instead of walking across the county every morning, abandoning their kids to angry forces, if you're concerned about national security, instead of abandoning their kids and walking for water just to give them life-sustaining water and walking more every year, those mothers could walk across the square and they would pump that water. And if we gave it to them, what would they think? God bless America. God bless America. I'm not even talking about Christian compassion here. I'm talking about national security, because apparently that's what resonates with Americans. That's called soft power. We need soldiers in Afghanistan, okay. But I understand it costs in the neighborhood of $1 million a year to keep 1 extra soldier in Afghanistan. Let's make a smart cost-benefit analysis here. 1 more soldier, $1 million, or 100 wells in 100 thirsty communities, so all the moms in those communities could stay home and pump that water every morning and say, God bless America. It's an investment. Again, forget compassion, national security, if that's what you need. But there's also that compassionate end of it. And when you travel, you do realize that this world is filled with beautiful people, with powerful love, the love between a parent and a child. Most of us, all of us have been there. The love between a parent and a child. One of the most powerful lessons I've ever had in my travels was when I was a kid in Oslo. I was in the big park behind the palace, Frogner Park. And I remember, just from my own little ethnocentric teeny bopper perspective, my parents were just loving me ridiculously. It seemed nonsense to me. It was a pill. They were spending a lot of extra money. I didn't deserve this. They were just like lavishing their love and attention on me. And then I looked out in that park and it was speckled with other families, and all those parents were loving their kids just as amazingly as my parents were loving me. And it occurred to me, from my little teeny bopper perspective, this world is home, apparently, to billions of equally lovable little children of God. I'm so thankful for that recognition that I got through travel. Let me close with one of my favorite teaching tools when I'm a tour guide in Turkey. I love to take our groups into a situation where they're a little bit out of their comfort zone, like being close to a whirling dervish. What's with this guy? Okay, I'm just going to paraphrase this in a little bit of a silly way, but it's essentially the conversation. I was with 20 Americans in this Turkish town. My goal as a travel teacher, a tour guide, was to let my group meet a dervish. So I went out and I found a dervish. I said, "Hi, I'm an American tour guide. I got 20 Americans. Can we watch you whirl?" He said, "I'm not a photo op, I'm a monk. But if you want to watch me pray, I will do that as long as I can explain to you what I'm doing." I said, "Great, when and where?" "My rooftop, sundown. I'll be there." So we gathered on his rooftop, sun was going down. He came out dressed up as a dervish. He said, "Welcome, I am a dervish. You Christians would call it a monk. I follow the prophet Mevlana. He's kind of like the St. Francis for us Muslims. He's the prophet of love. Everybody can get their brains around Mevlana. I think you call him Rumi, the same guy, Rumi. 5 times a day, I pray thinking of the teaching of my prophet Rumi. I plant one foot in my home, my family, my community. The other foot goes around and celebrates the diversity in God's great creation. One arm goes up to accept the love of our Maker, and the other arm, like the spout of a tea kettle, goes down, showering God's love on his creation. And I whirl, and I lose myself in that beautiful idea, endeavoring to become a conduit of God's love, thinking of my family and my community, celebrating the diversity on this planet. I remember watching him, losing himself in a meditative trance, his head tilted over, his robe billowed out. And then, as a tour guide, I remember looking over at my American travelers and seeing the wonder sweep over their face. And it occurred to me, this is good travel. Something that was a little bit freaky is now less so. And they're going to go home with less fear, more empathy, and more understanding. They're going to go home with what I think is the most beautiful souvenir, and that's a broader perspective. And then, when they implement that broader perspective as citizens of this great nation of ours, that's making travel a political act. And I think that has never been more important. Thank you very much for coming today, and happy travels. Thank you. Thank you very much. And happy travels. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.